Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in to ChannelBK. My name is Brian and welcome to another album review, and this one is for Radiohead's Amnesiac. Radiohead is an acclaimed British alternative and art rock group, and this is their 5th studio album. And obviously to many people it is also considered the sort of sister album to 2000's Kid A. Now when I was first introduced to Radiohead, going back and sort of hearing all this talk, all this hype about them, Kid A was always the one album that everybody talked about. It is honestly, in my opinion, a very important piece of work, not just for Radiohead, for defining them as a group, but also for rock music, and it still holds up for the new millennia, and I think it's still as impactful of an album as ever. At the same time though, as much as I appreciate it and I still really like it, I think that album is a tad overrated, and I know now every motherfucker and every Radiohead fan is disliking this, commenting all pissed off. I don't think this album is bad. I actually think it's really, really good. Obviously, to me, the reason why, yes, it is still an album that's impactful, because when I was first introduced to them, I heard a lot more of their earlier alternative work, mainly an album like The Bends. And then, obviously, once I got to OK Computer, which I think, like most fans of the group, that is probably my personal favorite album of the group. I love how grand it is. I love all these ideas. I think the lyrics are fantastic. I think the music is just captivating and well put together. And Tom sounds as amazing as ever on this record as well. So for them to sort of go into Kid A, to sort of go for that radical jump, I think it was very ballsy and daring as ever, and I still think it's still something that has impacted the band in a really beautiful way. But I don't necessarily think Kid A is overrated because of the whole OK Computer Kid A debate. I actually think Kid A is a little overrated compared to Amnesiac, because I think a lot of people think Amnesiac is either a glorified B-side album, or like they said, it is a sister album because it was recorded in the same sessions. This album to me has a lot of similarities and differences, but to me, I always found this album a lot better for some reason. Now, there's certain particular things that are different about Kid A in this album. One of the things that I took away from Kid A is I think it hits you a lot harder. I think Amnesiac takes a lot more to sort of sit in, even though there are tracks on here that hit you right in the face with a lot of the weird experimentation. But overall, I honestly think the one thing about Kid A is, even though there's a lot more, I think, grandness and a lot heavier sort of sounds and all this sort of stuff, I think that album focuses a lot more on the electronic aspect and that sort of sonic wavelength, whereas I think Amnesiac focuses a lot more on this really kind of dense instrumentation, but also very sparse instrumentation as well. Like, I think the atmosphere is still very similar. I think there are obviously a lot of moments on here, like a lot of the instrumental pieces on here, or those sort of cuts are obviously very apparent of Kid A. But at the same time, I feel like this album has this really just fascinating human element that I think Kid A still really has. But I think Kid A, I think that was a lot more of an album that used sort of the electronics and that sort of atmosphere for the instrumentation, whereas I think on this album, the actual instrumentation is used a lot more, with the electronics sort of serving as a sort of backbone. And another thing is, this album, to me, lyrically has a lot of intriguing concepts of obviously things that they've talked about before, like politics, as well as like a lot of ideas of fame and success. Like a song like Packt like Sardines and Crushed Tin Box is this idea of looking back on sort of your old failures or sort of things that you messed up in life, and you sort of realizing that that doesn't make you a bad person, but also the ideas of how society views you now, even though you yourself understand that you are not this type of person. And a song like Dollars and Cents, which I guess at first can be interpreted as a song about being conscious of sort of your own sadness and depression, but using that not as an excuse to stay in that funk, but use it as an excuse to get yourself out of that and realizing who you are as a person and not wanting to be in that position all the time. But then in a weird way, it sort of transitions into more of a metaphor about how you can use those opinions in your thoughts to impact the government, even though the government is trying to tell people to stay quiet and to, again, like, stay very calm. And then sort of the final, like, chorus to this track is Tom singing about how corporations don't look at people as people. They become statistics at a point, and that's what they need to thrive. And then something like Fame, which is brought up on the very last track in here, Life in a Glass House, which that title in a way is sort of the overall metaphor, an overarching metaphor of celebrities being viewed all the time by all these tabloids, all these people, how they have to sort of watch what they say even though those people don't need to watch what they say. And how Tom, again, references sort of these ideas, especially in the chorus, about how he wants to sort of talk to people, have conversations, but to remember that people are watching and there's no privacy. Again, like living your life inside of a glass house. And sort of this weird idea of just prying eyes looking into these people's lives and his sort of take on tabloids and that sort of journalism. But at the same time, like, again, I think a lot of the instrumentation is overlooked on this album because I think there's a lot of really fantastic pieces of work on here in terms of instrumentation. So many fantastic chord progressions and these really just kind of out there beats, like the intro track. This trippy dance backbeat with sort of this kettle drum pounding in the background, or something that has a lot of these more heavy instrumentations and well thought out instrumentations like Knives Out, which I think is one of the most chilling songs on the whole album. And I think, like, you know, with the guitar and the bass and the drums, especially sort of with the cymbal hits, really add to sort of this chilling track, which is sort of this metaphor of cannibalism and the darkness of that. But later on in the track, especially in verse 2, it sort of brings up this topic of possibly like what the music industry is like, which is something Tom has discussed, and sort of that allegory of violence and competition in the music business. And there's like that whole squash his headline, and it feels very apparent that he uses both of those metaphors really well on the track. But again, the instrumentation works well. But again, like, one of my favorite Radiohead songs is on this album as well, which has, I think, one of the most iconic chord progressions, which is Pyramid Song. Just the way that the pianos just chillingly open this track and Tom's swooning voice along with the strings really just have this fantastic build. And the lyrics on this track are so heavy but uplifting because I think the instrumentation works well, especially when it builds in the second half. Just these swelling and just grand hypes. It's like absolutely just hauntingly beautiful and epic. But it's him sort of discussing, apparently what we kind of can hear in the lyrics is him committing suicide in these lasting moments about, you know, life flashing before his eyes, all these other people that are here probably with him, the fact that he has to just give in at a point. And I really love the lyric when he's sort of falling into the river and he says, you know, he's seeing all my pasts and presents. I think that's like a really, really poetic line. But then again, like something like I Might Be Wrong has this really like experimental like blues riff. Well, I don't want to say experimental, but just this weird blues riff that Johnny has. More so of the experimental end is, like I said, the final track, Life in a Glass House, which features this sort of like New Orleans sort of funeral jazz sound. And they bring on Humphrey Littleton, who is a famous English trumpet player, to sort of add his sound to it. And I think it works fantastic on this final track. And I think like a track like Pyramid Song also kind of lends its way well into a track like You and Whose Army, which again starts very quiet and somber, and Tom just builds to this just huge crescendo at the end. And just, God, Tom's vocals, I think, on this album are also so underappreciated. Like, I think this album, again, to a lot of people is either very overrated or very underrated, and just, he sounds fantastic. Like, I think he goes to so many different areas on here. I think more so than I've seen on maybe some other albums, and I think just his emotions are so scattered and varied, and he does so many interesting things with his voice. And then there's also references back to Kid A with something like Morning Bell / Amnesiac, which is the original cut from the sessions, and it's a little different. There's lyrics that are changed. There's more of like a xylophone style influence to it. It's a little bit slower as well. And honestly, I find this track a little bit better than the one on Kid A, because the one on Kid A is a little bit more low-key, but it's a little bit more up-tempo. There's something about this cut, like, I don't think it's necessarily like just disturbing, but just Tom's vocals with the bells, at least when you first hear the song, is like very jarring. I think in a good way though, like, and it throws you off for a minute. Now, again, I don't necessarily want this to sound like this is my absolute favorite album of Radiohead's. It's definitely up there, even though I do think there are one or two moments on here that are a little like, iffy for me. Something like Polk/Pole Revolving Doors, which I like the sentiment. I think Tom's sort of imagery of all these different types of doors that lead you to places and sort of finding yourself and going on these new paths is good. I just feel like the actual instrumentation and whatnot on it is a little iffy. It reminds me just this much of one of my least favorite tracks off of Kid A, which is the self-titled track, Kid A. And again, I know they're not similar and they don't sound the same, but that kind of what it reminded me of. It was just sort of one part near the beginning that was like, it's cool for what it is and I respect it, but it's just not a track that grabs me in. Or something like Spinning Plates, which I don't want to say I hate as much, and it's not, again, like, I really respect what he's doing vocally and lyrically. Like, I think this idea of calling out nations that are bringing people to war even though they don't want it, and it's almost like you're just slaughtering them for nothing. Like, I don't want to be a part of this, and so on and so forth. And I think that in itself is a great reason to like this track, and this metaphor of spinning plates, how you can't just keep doing this forever and ever before something just ends up falling apart. I think it's really great. And I really think it is kind of interesting what Tom did, like how he sang this whole song backwards, and that's why it sounds as weird. I just think the sound of this track is still something that I've gotten used to a lot over time, but it's still not necessarily grasping me as much as other tracks on here. But I think, again, like, the experimentation on this is not as bad as I would assumed it'd be, because I think for the most part, every place they went to on here with what they were trying to do, to me, is so much more interesting and intriguing than some of the stuff I know off of Kid A. At the end of the day, I'm on Team Amnesiac, personally, myself. Kid A is still a great album and all that sort of stuff, and I don't necessarily think Amnesiac is their best album, but at the end of the day, I do honestly think it's very underrated. I think there's so many interesting strengths on here, and I think this is, to me, a good representation of what Radiohead can be, because I think OK Computer is something that everyone goes back to. Kid A is something everyone goes back to. But again, this is an analogy I like to use a little too much, but it is a best of both worlds. It's all these great concepts, themes, and ideas in this really stunning instrumentation from OK Computer, but also the electronics, the atmosphere, the somberness, and all that of Kid A. And I think it forms into a beautiful, beautiful baby. But so if you guys heard Amnesiac, what do you guys think? What are some of your favorite tracks and all that? And if you've never heard this album, please go listen to it and rinse repeat with what I just said in the comments below. If you liked, please like and please subscribe. We're going to be continuing this week with more classic reviews. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you for tuning in to ChannelBK. Peace out, guys.